Okay, good morning, and welcome to day two of the IFIN's Food Classification Workshop. For those of you who remember yesterday, we had some terrific talks that set the stage, learned about other food classification systems that have been developed over the years and some of the deficiencies in the existing systems. Nobody seems to congregate around one and dance around the maypole saying we've got a success so far. We've learned how metrics for assessing the healthfulness of dietary patterns have been developed over time from some of our speakers. But today, we're going to talk more about potential mechanisms linking processed foods to various health outcomes. We'll hear from our speakers, and we'll have some time for questions across the panel after hearing from everyone. And so first, we're going to start with Dr. Mike Gibney. Dr. Gibney is Emeritus Professor of Food and Health at University College Dublin. He served as the inaugural director of the UCD Institute of Food and Health. And Dr. Gibney will share some overarching thoughts on key challenges to address in these discussions about foods with various levels of processing. Mike, the floor is yours.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here, and particularly to Courtney and Marie for their hard work in organizing me. Now, these are my disclosures, and I'll give you a minute to read them. Okay, you got it. I want to start off by looking at the state of play, the current state of play, because what I see is a huge movement towards the study of processing in public health nutrition. And it's becoming to dominate many areas of funding and policy and so forth. And personally, I cannot see it being justified. So what I want to do first is let you know where we are, and I'll ask the question, is it broken? So, the primary goals of public health nutrition are to optimize nutrient intake, obviously, to minimize non-communicable diseases and to eliminate nutrient deficiencies. But there is a constraint. The food has to be available, it has to be affordable, and it has to be acceptable. Now, this is how we've achieved things so far, through randomized control trials, with a mix of randomized control trials and epidemiology. We've established the biology that links nutrients to a wide range of chronic diseases, cancer being perhaps the one big exception because it's different sites in the body. It's very complicated to study. But by and large, I think this is a pretty good start to a battle against non-communicable diseases. I want to say that if we're going to look at deficits in ultra-processed foods or anything else, we ought to look at deficits within our existing system. And there's no doubt about it, energy underreporting is a huge problem. And the main reason it's a problem is that we have no way of identifying what foods have been underreported. Simply no way. The second is, we're not doing meal pattern analysis. We have no idea about food-food correlations. People talk about dietary patterns, but that's gross dietary patterns. I want to know what's the probability if an adult American eats a steak, what is the probability that he would have spaghetti with it or chips with it? But we don't know that. And so when we talk about diet, we're talking about foods and patterns, but in between people eat meals. And there's very little literature on this, but I picked out, there's about a dozen papers on this. I picked out two. On the right is one of mine, and on the left is one of my daughters. So I'm a proud daddy. My first conclusion, we have an excellent knowledge base on the biology of diet-disease relationships. We need more work on certain areas. It ain't broke, so don't fix it. And it works, but of course it could work better. And let's work on that. Now, along came new concepts about a decade ago. And I want to start with what I think was the factor precipitating all of that. It's Michael Pollan. Michael, in his book, In Defense of Foods, talks about nutritionism. And let me just quote from one of his sections in his book. Nutrients as compared with foods are invisible, slightly mysterious, It falls to the scientists to explain the hidden reality of foods to us. This is a quasi-religious idea. The visible world is not the one that really matters, which implies the need for a priesthood. So now you're all formally ordained into the priesthood of the Church of Nutrition. Congratulations. And then later on, the co-founder of NOVA echoed this almost remarkably, Jeffrey Cannon. He says, nutrition creates an elite class of experts, keepers of the secrets, possessive of their elevated status and arcane knowledge. They condemn alternative practices or disciplines as meddlers, ravers, or quacks, heretics, pagans, or witches. This is serious business. So the first paper that I found that came out on processing was in Public Health Nutrition, and very shortly afterwards in a Portuguese or Brazilian journal, the idea for a new classification of foods. It's important to look at why do they want a new classification of foods. So let me explain what they say. And I would encourage all of you to go back and read the original papers of ultra-processed food. Don't read the headlines. Read the details, because you'll learn an awful lot. They say, our science has become discredited. It continues to depend on concepts and food classification systems devised almost a century ago, which are now obsolete. It, the food pyramid, derives from a century-old classification of foods into 4 to 7 groups, broadly based on their relative content of chemical constituents. By chemical constituents, they mean nutrients. Now, if you ask yourself, where did the 4 and the 7 come from? Well, the 7 comes from the rationing in this country during World War II. And it was one of the first foundation diets put forward to assist Americans to achieve a reasonable intake of energy and protein in the hope that micronutrients would follow. And then in 1956, when things got a lot better, they introduced the basic 4. So that's where this 4 and the 7 comes from. So is our existing classification system broke? And my answer is no. There's over 7,000 foods in your database. There's over 5,000 codes in your national survey, NHANES. You can do anything you like with that data. You can aggregate it this way, that way, upside down, inside out. You can do what you like. So to talk about our classification system is pure and utter nonsense. So my next slide, this incidentally is Reagan Bailey's data. I was just showing them that you can classify it any way you like. And Reagan has done this study on added sugars in the US diet. She rearranged everything according to what she believed to be correct, or her team did. And it's all published here. So you can do what you like with these data. Not only do we have good data in terms of codes of food composition and codes of food consumption, but we can deal with dietary patterns, as was mentioned yesterday. We have the Mediterranean diet, but I want to make a point. I live in Europe. There's 2 shores to the Mediterranean diet. There's the northern shore, which everyone talks about, but the southern shore is North Africa, and it's a completely different diet. So use the word Mediterranean diet carefully. The DASH diet was mentioned yesterday, and of course the Nordic diet is popular in Europe as well. But not only can we look at patterns, but we can look at the global dietary intake and evaluate its merit based on food patterns. And we can use the Global Diet Quality Index or the Healthy Eating Index. And we can do the same for nutrients using Adams' nutrient-rich factor. So we can do a lot with this. And then in addition, when the dietary guidelines came out, the USDA produced food patterns. These are remarkable things. They cover caloric levels all the way up. They list typical lunches, dinners, breakfasts, and so forth. And to argue, they have this pattern for US style, for vegetarians, for Mediterranean patterns. To argue that the food classification was devised almost a century ago and is now obsolete is absolute nonsense. There's utterly flexible to do what you like with it. Now, our capacity to explore food consumption patterns, I'll just quickly go through this, is excellent, and the case for a new classification system just simply isn't justified. Now, any get your gun. Anything you can do, I can do better. So when the University of Sao Paulo produced something, everyone else followed. And down at the bottom of this slide, these little choir boys. Question is, are all these things singing from the same hymn sheet? And as I'll show you, they are not. The first study used Portuguese data, and it looked at what's called the discrepancy range of 556 foods. And basically, anything over 50 is disastrously misclassified across systems. So across those 4 systems of defining food classification, they got it wrong in half of them. Just a complete mess. The next one is from a study using just 130 foods from the Euromonitor. And what I'm going to just show you is extracts from the paper using pie charts. If they were all the same, they'd look the same, but they don't look the same. These are the same 135 foods. Let's classify them using NOVA. Let's classify them using North Carolina. Let's classify them another way. And you just get a completely different picture. Now, I want to move from foods and the classification of foods. I want to move to biological endpoints. And I'm going to cite this paper from Spain. It uses the PREDIMED database, which is a very famous database, very, very comprehensive. It's nutrients, anthropometric data, clinical data, biochemical data. And what they did in this paper is they recoded the PREDIMED database according to the degree of food processing. And they defined food processing using NOVA, the International Agency for Research in Cancer System, the International Food Information Council, and the University of North Carolina. And the question is, did they get the same answer? Now, this to me is the death knell of these systems. There is absolutely no agreement. The only place they agree is for LDL cholesterol and triglycerides, in which they say there's no relationship. But other than that, it's all over the place. And you can't go around and say, well, you know, NOVA is a nice one. Let's pick that. Popularity doesn't play any role in science. This is where it ends. This is not working. And anyone who thinks it's working is ignoring the scientific facts. So my third conclusion is each of the many food classification systems is the subjective opinion of a small group of scientists. And if we sat down together, we could come up with another classification system. It would still disagree. They're as different as snowflakes in a snowstorm as regards almost all endpoints. Now, I want to talk about biological systems. I know that we talked about biological systems at the beginning, looking at all the things we have strong data on. And I want to look at systems that might be involved in processed foods. These are just some. Now, I could have cluttered this slide up with more of the diseases that have been associated through correlation with ultra-processed food. And it's difficult for me to understand, for example, frailty. Frailty is associated in older people with low protein intakes, but most importantly, with social isolation. So I don't understand this. And I don't understand how eating disorders can be influenced by a process that's promoting obesity. I just don't get it. So do we have any biological or plausible mechanism? And the answer to me is, I haven't seen one yet, but I'm going to go through a few thoughts that these people have. First of all, you can look at, say, the nutrients and say, you know, it's nutrients. Or you can look at phytochemicals and say, well, it's inadequate levels of certain phytochemicals. Or you can look at packaging material and say it's the material that migrates from packaging into food that's causing all the problem. Or you could look at chemicals that are produced during industrial processing, or you could say it's food additives. Now, in many, many studies of ultra-processed food and health, when they correct for nutritional quality, the effect remains. So what they're saying is, it ain't nutrients, it's something else. At least in about 5 studies they've done that. Several don't agree with this, they don't find the same answer, but most of them that have looked at it do. So let's look at what the explanations is. When they say that it's independent of nutrient quality, these are the 3 diseases that have been studied in this regard. And the question is, what is the hazard? The most popular target are food additives, and I want to spend a minute on that. Now, Before I go down the road, I want to explain really clearly how important and how detailed food additives are studied. The European Food Safety Authority do it, the FDA does it, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives of the WHO, Codex does it, and so on, all around the world. It's an independent panel of scientists, unpaid, and they make a big contribution. And they have volumes upon volumes of toxicological data. I served on the Scientific Review for Food, and it was pre-digital era, and you could measure in meters the volumes you had to read or look at. And these committees decide to permit the use of food additives if the toxicological data supports it. And if somebody comes along with a new study to say, I found something wrong with this, they will say, well, let's have a look. They can revise it up or down, and continue to permit it, or they can remove it. And that happens all the time. It's just a normal process of toxicological evaluation. Now, in one study, is from breast cancer. They found it to be independent of nutrient intake. So they speculated it was food additives, and they mentioned these additives. So I'll go through them. The nitrosamines at the 95th percentile raise a health concern. Titanium dioxide is no longer permitted, so I don't know why they're mentioning that. Acrylamide increases the risk of developing a cancer, but as was mentioned yesterday, processing engineers have more or less got rid of it from industrially prepared food, but it's still present in the kitchen and in the barbecue. The PAHs are, again, a cause for concern. Endocrine disruptors, the European Food Safety Authority says there's no concern from dietary exposure, maybe from other exposures, and the nitrates and nitrites have a link to cancer. But here's the challenge for these guys. I want to know which of these, or how they're going to study the link between any one of these and, say, periodontal disease or atopic dermatitis, both of which are associated with ultra-processed food. How are you going to study that? How are you going to put together a piece of biology that explains that? Now, when they fail, when they realize how difficult that task is, they always turn to the theory of cocktails. It's not just one additive, it's when they're all together. Wow. It's a French study, over 100,000 people, dietary data. They were very, very fortunate in France to have very detailed chemical data on not just the occurrence of food additives in foods, but the concentration. And so they were able to look at exposure. And in this instance, what they looked at is clustering. And these are clusters of additives that go together normally in the French diet. Now, the observed clusters are not based on toxicology. They're based on dietary habits. So bread goes with butter, French fries, fizzy drinks, and Mac burgers, say. That's all. It's just associations of what people eat. There's no biology in this. Now, if I take the one in red and say, well, let's have a look at that particular cocktail. Oh, let's use this. There's 5 additives in this cocktail. Iron oxide is very poorly absorbed, so there's no systemic effect. That's it. Ascorbic acid, I mean, you can't live without it. Sodium erythorbate is an isomer of ascorbic acid. It is the same ADME, the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of ascorbic acid. So that's off the calendar. Nitrite is associated with cancers, but safe levels of intake are being reconfirmed recently by EFSA. An extract of rosemary, obtained from the herb, no known adverse effect. So it's going to be very difficult for people to construct a biological theory linking food additives with many of those diseases I showed you, all of which are etiologically very different. This is a study that myself and Kieran did. And we took the French data and we looked at the intake reported in the paper of a number of additives. And I just decided I'd look at natural sources. So if you look at an egg, one egg gives you 3 times as much lecithin as the average French person eats from industrially prepared foods. You go through all of these and you find, so if you're going to study the impact of, say, lecithin, you can't just say, I'm going to do it from industrially prepared foods. You have to take into account it's present in soybean oil, it's present in many foods. That's going to be a huge challenge for them in working out a biological system. And people said to me recently that, you know, you're not dealing here with colors. Well, I'm just mentioning colors here because more than half the colors that are used are natural ones. All of which, by the way, don't get into the food system without going through the same toxicology as an industrially derived one. And I just noticed recently, I didn't believe it at first, but I've looked it up and it's apparently true. McDonald's have taken everything out of their hamburgers. So I just want to know, is it ultra processed now? Because so the first conclusion I have is toxicological databases contain a plethora of data on positive and negative aspects of additives in biological systems. And this is an important point. The data is there. Use it. Otherwise, don't infer it. The additive cocktail theory has no basis for a role in health. And if you take all the additives out of something, is it still ultra-processed? Now, I want to come, this is an important part, the art and the science of food classification. I'm going to start off with the art. This is from Professor Montero, and he deals particularly with bread. I want to show you now, this is what he writes about bread. Bread is not a good choice as a staple food, and sandwiches are not a good alternative to proper meals. He goes on to say, most sandwiches made at home or sold in shops use uniform, degraded, cheap, pre-sliced, soggy, floppy products. I put the two guys from the Muppets up there because, to me, this is ex cathedra statements. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on and lists, in numerical order, 7 reasons why you should avoid bread, and why bread is an ultra-processed food. Number 1, it's fairly energy dense. It's salty. It's not eaten by itself, so much of the profit is from taking it out. It displaces better staple foods. It displaces better crops. And the last one is fantastic. Bread ruins established cultures and economies. Now, those of you who support ultra-processed food and believe that NOVA is a good classification, this is the basis for their beliefs. This is not based on any toxicology or biology or anything like that. It's just silly statements, which I just kind of see how we can possibly work with that. And just to put it in picture, this is the United States data, the contribution of bread to the US. It makes a fairly good, impressive contribution to a lot of micronutrients and macronutrients. So it's pure nonsense to talk about bread ruining economies and cultures and so on. Now, if you were to move from the subjective definition to the objective definition, what we should do, I thought about this for a long time, and it's very difficult. The first thing I do is I'd start off with Adams Donowski's Nutrient-Rich Food Index. And I'd rank all the foods according to whether they were good or bad. But that's not good enough, you see. You need to know what the population impact of the food is. I'll explain that as follows. There are 3 types: frequency of intake per eating occasion, and percent consumer. So Christmas pudding, it's laced with fat and with sugar, and often with alcohol. Although you burn the alcohol on top, it's eaten in large quantities 1 day of the year. So would you bother putting that into your problems? Intakes per eating occasion. Mayonnaise, 4 grams per serving. Would you bother about that? I'd say that goes down the list now. I don't care how high it was in terms of nutrients. And percent consumers. If there's only a few consumers, it goes down the list even further. So you have to take the nutritional qualities of a food, and you have to know its population impact. And when you do all that, you'll still face problems. The problems you're going to face is that no matter how objective the system is, you're going to come up with a negative value for these foods. Cambazola, traditional fish sauce, mortadella, butter, nuts, and chorizo. Now, if anyone tells me that they're going to put black labels on these, on my cheese, go away. It's not going to work. So they're all high in fat. So this is a big problem. And this is why they brought in additives, because none of these have additives. That's my firm belief as to why they brought in the relationship with additives. So My fifth conclusion is that a subjective construction of new food classifications is not acceptable. When we gather the facts on nutrient intakes and their population impact, and we want to advise people, people in government do their best. They put a pyramid, they put nutrition facts, they put labels. I personally think the future will be digital. I think there will be personalized dietary advice. I don't mean genes or anything like that. Personalized dietary advice, smart fridges, smart kitchens. Samsung and Philips are both working independently, and Samsung have a deal with Nestle. I've been in the Philips smart kitchen in Eindhoven. It's quite remarkable. It's brilliant. And that's the future. Now, here's what Nova wants us to talk about. It tells us that this does not mean that occasional consumption of ultra-processed products is itself likely to be bad. Now, wait a second. What's occasional? Once an hour? Once a day? Once a week? And whatever you come up with, I want to know, how did you come up with that? Why is that safe and not a little bit more unsafe? How do you do it? And then, in the same breath and in the same papers, they say there are many reasons to avoid the consumption of ultra-processed foods and drinks. And that's probably the one I hear most from the publications on ultra-processed food. So do we really need a new classification system at all, based on the degree of processing? I think we do, but for two different reasons. The first relates to the concept of food systems, which is connecting agriculture and the impact of it on land, on water use, on greenhouse gas emissions, along with the problem of micronutrient deficiency, along with all sorts of other issues. Integrating all of that, we will need to be able to say this food scores badly in terms of greenhouse gas or whatever else it is. I think that would be useful to have. I think it's also advisable to think about this for carcinogens or potential carcinogens arising from processing. I don't think that's unreasonable. But my seventh and final conclusion is that it's no use in public health nutrition. It's entirely subjective. It completely disagrees right across the board. And this is very important. Don't tell me we can choose one over the other based on popularity or based on the number of times it has been studied. That is not science. That might be politics, it might be religion, it might be pop music, but it ain't science. Now, very quickly, my last two slides, looking at the future. This is a study from the Journal of Nutrition looking at meat eaters, pesco-vegetarians, vegetarians and vegans, and basically as you go from meat eater to vegans, your intake of ultra-processed food soars. And if you think that vegans, and my daughter is a vegan, my granddaughter is a vegan, if you think she's going to go home every night and prepare a vegan type dish, she'll do it some nights, but a lot of nights she's going to go to the supermarket and buy vegan food because it's just easier. In the same way that we do that at the moment. I don't go home, I don't make my own mayonnaise, I buy it. Now, these are some of the things you're going to see in the future. Three-dimensional pasta. Is that going to be a problem? Even if there's no additives in it, even if it's nutritionally balanced, will that frighten people? Should we be doing this? I've eaten three-dimensional pasta. It's delicious. The next one is from Singapore. And this is where they take stem cells from milk, differentiate them into cells of the mammary gland, culture them in a big tubular architecture, and they get real milk out of it. And then you have all of these other products. So I'll finish with that. And a quotation, science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. And I see a lot of enthusiasm in ultra-processed food and commend it, but it's not good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gibney. That was really terrific. In the interest of maintaining our schedule, we're going to move along to our next speaker, Dr. Kieran Ford, who gets the prize for traveling the greatest distance to come here and dealing with his disruption in circadian rhythm. Dr. Ford's the chair in Sensory Science and Eating Behavior at the Division of Human Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. He'll be speaking to the sensory properties of foods that are processed and impact on food intake. Dr. Ford.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the kind invitation from Marie and Courtney for this great meeting. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to talk about this topic actually, because a lot of what we hear about ultra-processed food is always linked back to things like likes and dislikes and perception. And although a lot of the emphasis has been on metabolic mechanisms, actually one of the main drivers of meal size is what we put in our mouth and how we perceive it. So I'll talk about that for the next few minutes. And first of all, these are my disclosures. I'm a PI on 2 public-private partnership projects, one of which is exploring the impact of ultra-processed food on energy intake. I'm a member of several scientific boards, and I've been an invited speaker at a few different places in the last couple of years, sometimes talking about processed food, sometimes talking about the influence of sensory properties on nutritional intakes as well. So we're going to go straight into it, and I'll start by talking about, I suppose, the trial that really set the world on fire in relation to ultra-processed food. And I know, Kevin, you're going to talk about this, of course, as well. But for those that are not familiar, Kevin ran a randomized controlled trial several years ago to look at a sort of a coarse comparison of minimally processed and ultra-processed diets and the impact that has on energy intake. And the trial, I think, captured the imagination of many people because it revealed very big differences in daily energy intakes, average daily energy intake, about 500 calories a day, with associated weight gain in the ultra-processed arms. And so the trial was really set up as a comparison. It was not a mechanistic trial to establish what drives differences in energy intake from ultra-processed foods. But if some trials are hypothesis testing, this was definitely hypothesis generating, and certainly there's been a lot of speculation as to what drives the differences observed in Kevin's trial since 2019. We did a quick calculation with my PhD students. We think that about 80% of the papers on ultra-processed food have been published since this trial, in fact, in terms of the sheer quantity of interest around cross-sectional epidemiological comparisons, association studies, and widespread speculation on the mechanisms linking process characteristics and the characteristics of processed foods, and then the associated link to health outcomes. I've just summarized a few from the literature here, the ones that have been most widely publicized, things like the impact of emulsifiers and additives. Mike touched on it earlier. The idea of hyperpalatability or heightened reward to food. And of course, the matrix in the microbiome is often listed as another example. And disruptions to taste-nutrient relationships when you process a basic food. So the question is, what drives meal size? And really, Kevin's trial really highlighted differences in meal size primarily. And so it's a quick pop quiz at the start of the talk to say, what influences meal size? I'm looking for suggestions from the audience. What drives the size of the meal you eat? Well, possibly, yeah, although that's a bit dubious in terms of its consistency. Any other suggestions? I think that's very important, yes. Barbara? Well, thank you, Barbara. Well, you've more or less taken the whole steam out of my slide, yeah. So the pop quiz, Barbara wins the prize at the end of today's lecture. Of course, liking drives meal size, and this has been very well known for many, many years. If you like a food, you tend to eat more of it. And this is linked to preferring certain amounts of food that you continue to consume, oftentimes in response to the hedonic properties of a food rather than any kind of homeostatic need. We are, of course, programmed to start to dislike a food as soon as we start to eat it, in that the hedonic valence of a stimulus decreases on consumption, so it's sensory-specific satiety, and you can postpone that by increasing variety. As Barbara highlighted, energy density is one of the most robust effects we've seen. If you have higher energy density, you tend not to adjust for that in your meal, and you can consume considerably more energy from a higher energy dense food. If I serve it in a larger portion or in a larger plate, I can also consume more. And indeed, eating rate, something we've studied for the last 10 or 12 years now, is an area that maybe was sometimes overlooked, but if you consume a meal more quickly, it's much easier to consume more food from that meal. And so these are sort of what we know in terms of what drives the onset of satiation, what drives the size of your meal. And this is reasonably a summary of more or less our knowledge to date, actually. There's not other things on top of that we don't really know about that drive meal size. And oftentimes in nutrition, if I'm talking to the nutritionists at this meeting, we talk about the nutritive properties of a food. And so we think about the composition of the food, its energy content, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And we design strategies around reducing energy density or limiting public health sensitive nutrients of concern. From a public health standpoint, we look at the food environment and we think about things like calorie labeling or taxing public health sensitive nutrients, or we put limits on portion sizes, for example. And these are ways in which we can control our access to calories within the food environment. But an area that's oftentimes overlooked is how we interact with the food itself, how we eat food, and how we respond to the stimuli we encounter during a meal, things like hedonics, but also things like taste, texture, and how that influences our decision to continue to consume or how it can delay the onset of satiation. And so I'm going to talk about that for the next 15 or 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about, briefly highlight some of the areas around liking and hedonics, how it drives intake, sensory cues specifically on texture and taste. I'll talk a little bit about the link between satiety and UPF, and then I'll very, very briefly at the end touch on cosmetic flavors and the idea that cosmetic flavors may be promoting overconsumption. So let's start with liking. This is an area that's been studied extensively for a very, very long time. And since the invention of the 9-point hedonic scale in the 50s, we've understood how to quantify people's likes and dislikes for food and link that to their intake behavior. This is just one of the traditional study on this from nearly 30 years ago from Martin Yeomans in Sussex, who produced a pasta with a pasta sauce. He made a bland version of the pasta sauce and then he added herbs to it, and you can see intake goes up with a slightly more palatable pasta sauce. And then when you continue to add herbs to it, it becomes too strong and people start to stop eating. So liking is linked to the consumption of grams of food within an ad libitum test meal. And there's been vast amounts of research done on this, to the extent that even sensory influences on intake have sometimes been summarized just as likes and dislikes. But as I'll show you, there's much more happening with regards to how we interact with the sensory properties of a food. And there's a very detailed and comprehensive review of the influence of liking on intake, written 20 years ago now. This is not a new idea. And you know, I've highlighted some of the literature on this going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. Adam has written extensively on the influence of salt and sugar in terms of preferences and liking and intake as well. And so these are sort of classic papers in our field about how liking drives intake. But recently, about 4 years ago, Terra has produced a new concept of hyperpalatability, and this is a little bit different from traditional liking. The idea here is that when you have certain ratios of salt and fat, sugar and fat, and salt and carbohydrates, that you get this hyperpalatable response. And it's outlined in this flowchart from the paper in obesity, that these combined with processing aids and higher energy density to produce this hyperpalatable response, a response to a food that's above and beyond what we traditionally know as liking. And Kevin has also reanalyzed data from 2 of the inpatient clinical trials that he's run, and also come to the same conclusion that there's maybe a link with these certain combinations of salt and fat, sugar and fat, that may be also responsible for driving higher intakes and higher liking. And so I pose the question is, could it be that the modern processed food environment is just too tasty and rewarding and overrides our physiological exposures to delay the onset of fullness and actually promote heightened reward values that maybe promote excessive consumption? And just taking data from Kevin's own study, we see that, of course, when the average ratings for pleasantness across the different meals were the same, actually, when they're rated. People liked the meals equivalently across both studies. And thankfully, with Kevin's involvement, we were able to go back and look at that data and see that even at an individual level, people, of course, differ in how they like or dislike certain foods. And those who liked foods more, ate more, as we would say, in line with what we already understand from conventional literature. But they did so for both minimally processed and ultra-processed diets. And so there was no trend within the diet that might be driving higher or lower liking. I think one of the areas that's interesting in this topic, and I think there's definitely a need for further research, and I know Kevin will probably talk about his trial that he's currently running on that topic, is the idea that there's an interaction and interplay between energy density and taste that's oftentimes overlooked. And Adam has done the work on this 40 years ago, that at low levels of taste intensity, we're very good at discriminating levels of fat. At higher levels of taste intensity, we can't discriminate fat any longer. We become fat blind. And it leads to very easy missing of the energy density of the foods we're eating, and oftentimes can promote higher energy consumption. And indeed, energy density is one of the topics that was raised after Kevin's trial came out, and I know, Barbara, you've written a lot about this as well, that the extensive efforts were made to balance the energy presented to participants in an ad libitum trial, and a lot of work went into making these diets, equivalent in so many different things. Nevertheless, when it comes to non-beverage energy density, you could see there was a significant difference in the non-beverage energy density between the 2 diets, with the ultra-processed diet being slightly higher. We've encountered the same challenges when we've studied ultra-processed food consumption, because it's very hard to balance energy density. It tends to be more energy dense. And although liking was the same, the food selected was quite different. The people tended to eat slightly higher energy densities from those ultra-processed meals. Even nominal differences in energy density, 0.1 kilocalories per gram, can lead to on average about 100 calories difference in intake a day. So although maybe to the outside looking in, it doesn't look like a big difference, in practice these things can have a significant impact. So energy density is important, and the combination of sensory properties and energy density combine to maybe to promote higher intake. And that's something that's not unique to ultra-processed food. That's something that happens across all levels of processing. But I talk now a little bit about taste. And so although a lot of the focus in sensory research has been about how liking drives intake, for the last number of years we've been doing a huge amount of work to really understand the functional role sensory properties play beyond their role in just simply liking. So if you get two equivalently liked foods, and I change the intensity of the taste or I change the texture properties of that food, do you eat them differently? And the answer is yes, in fact. These properties of a food play a very functional role in directing our calorie selection, the rate at which we consume a food, and how we recognize the nutrients or the energy densities we're trying to consume. We've written about this extensively, but I'll just talk briefly about an area on sensory epidemiology, this idea of using taste databases to understand dietary patterns and applying the taste qualities of foods to understand differences in energy intake. This is work that was done by my former postdoc and also with Kees de Graaf and Wageningen. We produced a dietary database of taste intensities, about 800 foods in the Netherlands, about 500 in Malaysia, with databases also on rated taste intensities in Australia, in the US, and France. So we have thousands of foods that have been quantified in the same way to rate their taste perception intensity for sweet, sour, salty, sugar, and umami. And so what we can see then is we can correlate the presence of a taste substrate in your environment to its taste intensity. And you see a linear relationship. As monoundisaccharide concentration of a food increases, sweetness increases. And so you see sweetness is a great predictor of the sugar content of a food, but not such a great predictor of the energy content of a food. So you can start to ask questions about dietary patterns then using this type of an approach, this sensory epidemiology approach. One question we asked was whether or not there are differences in the taste-nutrient relationship when you change the degree of processing. And so this is a paper we wrote a couple of years ago where we related the presence of a taste substrate to the rated taste intensity of that substrate in those foods. And this is in about 300 foods from Singapore, and we classified those foods into their NOVA categorizations from minimally processed to ultra-processed. And we see that across the different taste substrate and nutrient relationships, the relationship is preserved across degrees of processing. It's not the case that processing disrupts this completely. Although, of course, needless to say, the relationship does shift. I mean, for example, processed food, as we heard yesterday, is the main contributor to salt intake. So the relationship between NaCl and saltiness is higher in processed food than it is, for example, in minimally processed food. But any suspicion that it might be that processing somehow is uncoupling our Paleolithic brain from the substrates that we normally encounter in food, there doesn't seem to be evidence for that. And we're bringing evidence to this question rather than just simply speculating. And we've reproduced these findings in 2 other countries as well, on top of the Singapore data. Another nice part of this is you can start to think about the relative contribution, not of fats, carbohydrates, and salt, or not fats, carbohydrates, and proteins to energy intake, but taste qualities. How does taste drive differences in energy intake? Because as eaters of food, we don't put food in our mouth and think, oh, that's an interesting percent fat I'm eating. We taste savory foods, we taste sweet foods, we taste salty foods. And so this is again data from Singapore, where we've taken Rob Van Dam's data from the Singapore multi-ethnic cohort, and we've broken 7,000 Singaporeans' daily energy intakes into 4 quartiles, low to medium to high to very high. And using this, then we can profile the relative contribution of different taste qualities to the differences in energy intake. And we did this primarily because there was a suspicion in Singapore about introducing a sugar tax, and that discretionary calories from sweetness were driving excessive energy intakes. When we look at the relative contribution of sweet foods in the red, we see that there's not a huge increase in sweetness of the diet as you get to higher energy intakes. Actually, the main increase in intake occurs with savory fatty foods. It's meal size. People's meals get bigger and the energy density of those meals gets bigger. It drives higher energy intakes. And so oftentimes, if we think about being a fat blind at high taste intensity or eating at a rapid rate, it's not hard to see how savory fatty meals could make a disproportionately higher contribution to our energy intakes because it's easy to consume those types of foods. We also went back and looked at the same data set in terms of low to high energy intakes and correlated the intakes back then to the relative contribution of different processing categories. And actually, it's a nominal increase from low energy to high energy. It's only a 3% increase in ultra-processed food. The main increase occurs for processed foods, and again, it's savory fatty foods that are primarily driving that increase in energy intake. So we were very careful to say this is data from one study, and it's diet data, so it's not the best dietary data in the world, but it does give us an indication that perhaps chasing some magic ingredient in these foods, perhaps chasing sweet foods, for example, may not be the right target if we think about just understanding how meal size changes as a function of the way we interact with the sensory properties. it might lead to new ideas as to how to think of ways to reduce those energy intakes. Now I'm going to talk briefly about texture. Anyone that knows me and my work will know I could happily talk about texture for the next 2 or 3 days, and we would never get home. But we've done a vast amount of work on how the physical properties of food influence the rate at which you consume them and the onset of satiation. So how texture can be used to change eating rate and can be also used to change meal size and energy intake. We've done some work on this in the past also because Kevin kindly invited us to contribute some measures to his RCT in 2019, and there we were quite surprised to see a sort of a result that showed higher energy intake in the ultra-processed arms were linked to both a higher eating rate, grams per minute, and also a higher energy intake rate in terms of kilocalories per minute. And this is also due to that non-beverage energy density difference, a 50% increase. And I think we were all quite surprised at how strong that result was in terms of the greater meal sizes were linked just to also foods that were higher in energy density and were easier to eat. And that's quite interesting then, because then you might say, well, maybe we've landed on something that's an interesting property of UPF that might actually be distinct to this category of foods and maybe also promoting greater energy intakes. So as I said, we've studied this for a long time, so we pooled data from 5 of our own studies and got about 330 foods and categorized them into minimally processed to processed to ultra-processed. And then from this, we could characterize their energy intake rates by multiplying objectively measured eating rate by the energy density of that food. And what you can see is there is indeed a sort of an overall average rise from 35 to nearly 70 kilocalories per minute across these 3 different categories. But of course, there's also very wide variability within those categories. So it's not the case that energy intake rate is specific to ultra-processed foods only. It's very variable. The thing I like about this definition, though, in terms of trying to understand energy intake is it's objective. We can understand it. Eating rate we can see as a reproducible trait of specific properties of a food, and its energy density is a compositional factor. So it combines the behavior with the composition in terms of how we eat these types of foods and how it drives intake up or down. We've separately done another study, again looking at Singaporean data to look at 7,000 Singaporeans to show actually to get to that highest level of energy intake at the level of the day, you have to have a disproportionately larger contribution of foods that are high in energy intake rate. You don't get it from consuming ultra-processed foods, you get it from having foods that are softly textured and more energy dense, and that's across all processing levels. That's what drives the higher energy intake, and we were able to relate this to a range of other cardiometabolic markers of health. But to revisit the finding from the original trial that Kevin ran, we wanted to run our own study as well, just to test whether or not it's really texture or processing that's driving the consumption in terms of meal size, in terms of ad libitum intake within a meal. And so to do this, we developed 4 test meals that varied in their composition in terms of the processed or unprocessed ingredients. And we also played on the texture properties of those test meals to produce eating rate differences that were stable and consistent. So a fast version of an ultra-processed meal, a slow version of an ultra-processed meal, a fast version of a minimally processed meal, a slow version of a minimally processed meal. And then we served 200 meals to 50 participants in a full crossover design, using all the best practice in terms of the kind of ad libitum test designs. And what we found was, I think, really quite striking and really quite consistent. Texture drives intake, not processing. Across both degrees of processing, the grams consumed were higher in the softly textured meals. They were eaten at a faster rate and eaten to a greater extent. And again, we tried our best to match the calorie differences, but there were still subtle differences in the energy density of the ultra-processed meal, and that manifests as a higher intake, an energy intake rate, kilocalories per minute. 21% difference in grams consumed, 26% difference in kilocalories consumed. These are big, big differences. The same people ate 20% more or less as a function purely of the sensory properties of those meals. And just to really drive this point home for this audience, I wanted to show you some new data we've collected that's unpublished, but it's been prepared for submission. This is from my colleague Marlu Lauschleft. We took 70 people and we gave them 5 ad libitum lunches in the Netherlands. The entire country eats sandwiches for lunch. That's just a given. Irrespective of the objections to bread in the previous talk, you won't take bread off the Dutch because that's what they eat for lunch every day. So we chose a conventional sandwich, medium energy density, medium eating rate, and we developed high energy and low energy versions of that sandwich, and we developed fast and slow versions of that sandwich. So just playing on the properties of the food and its composition to change its energy intake rate across both eating rate and energy density. And the chair is blocking it, but we also had them that they were all equally light. So these sandwiches were all equally light across the board. So we did a lot of work to develop up these test meals. And what we found was really interesting. This is the full crossover design. So within the same person, they had a range of 550 calorie difference from the highest to the lowest levels of intake. The same person, came to my lab for lunch. And across 5 weeks, the range of differences in your intake was 550 calories, a meal within a meal, purely as a function of differences in energy density, purely as a function of the differences in how I interacted with it and in terms of texture. And what we did was we went back and took away the medium lunch, so say today's sandwich, just to calculate the net difference in terms of energy intake. And what you can see is, of course, higher energy density, faster sandwiches, so consumed significantly more. What I think was also really interesting in terms of the future and how we take these findings forward is, for equally like sandwiches, we can change the texture and reduce the energy density using all the tricks of modern processing and formulation, and reduce the intake by 370 calories. I mean, these are just huge differences from an eating rate point of view, or an eating behavior point of view. So I think that sort of gives light to the idea that if we think of that in the context of the current arguments around hedonics and in terms of sensory cues that might drive meal size, it both identifies the problem, but also points to the direction of where the future solutions could be in terms of combining not just reformulation and compositional changes, but matching that with behavioral changes that can actually change how we interact with foods in the future. And we're working on that now at the moment. We have a very large randomized controlled trial that's getting underway later this year. We've done 2 years of development for the meals in this trial. This is one of the 2 public-private partnerships I mentioned at the beginning. This is the Restructure project. I won't go into the greater details of this, but I hope that maybe at a future IFANS meeting I can share the outcomes of our trial. It's a 2-arm crossover trial looking at UPF fast and UPF slow meals matched for all of the other criteria. And it's a 2-week feeding trial to look at intake. It's a public-private partnership. We have 11 advisory partners who are industry partners who are co-funding the work, and then the rest of the work is co-funded by the Dutch government. And we have an independent scientific advisory committee who effectively validate and guide us in terms of the design and the execution of the trial, to make sure we stay clear and honest in our comparisons. And so I think this is a sort of a replication of Kevin's trial, but really we're placing the emphasis exclusively on eating rate and how eating rate may moderate the intake of energy within and across meals on different diets. And I hope this will also help to bring data to this discussion so that we can have a more informed discussion in the future about is there something specific or not about the properties of these types of foods. Now, I won't go into this in great detail, but just to simply say in terms of satiety, claims have been made that ultra-processed foods deliver less satiety on a calorie-for-calorie basis, and this is due to the nature of the processing. And the original data for this comes from Jenny Brand-Miller's glycemic index data and Suzanne Holt's satiety data that was just merged and compared and categorized. And speculation has been then sent to say that perhaps UPF foods are less filling on a calorie-per-calorie basis. Again, data from Kevin's study highlights that that's not the case in terms of rated fullness. And more importantly, I think even still, in terms of snacking, there was no significant difference in snacking across those 2 arms, which I think is really striking, because if people were feeling hungrier after a UPF diet, they would certainly have reflected in snacking. This wasn't the case. But that's also, of course, a fairly blunt comparison and not controlled because it's an ad libitum trial. So the way to do that is to run a very fixed portion satiety trial, a challenge test. And we've done that as well. This is also in preparation. We took, again, soft and hard, fast and slow, unprocessed and highly processed meals, and we ran a satiety paradigm where you give people a fixed portion, in this case 600 calories, and then you track their subjective feelings of satiety over time. Now, if processing leads to less fullness, we should see that in this design. And what we see is actually there were, first of all, very little differences between the different meals, and the one meal that did stand out was the hard ultra-processed meal. So the meal that was eaten slower and that was from the ultra-processed category delivered slightly more fullness, and this was significant and reflected both in fullness ratings and in later snacking behavior was slightly lower. So if anything, the data doesn't support the fact that UPF are lower in satiety. If anything, it could be that eating behavior, eating rate is driving the fullness you derive on a calorie-per-calorie basis from calorie-matched meals. But the important point to also highlight here is a bit of levity in this discussion. These are small effects. This is not big effects. So although these are interesting and we can ask what might be driving that, it's certainly not the cure for the current modern food environment ailments, for example. So we have to keep this in context. There's no evidence to support a lower satiety for UPF. If anything, there's an evidence to say that the way you eat a meal could influence the satiety you derive from it. My last point is about cosmetic flavors. And again, this is because a lot of the definitions, and as Mike has highlighted, a lot of the discussion has been about the use of additives and synthetic and cosmetic flavors that have disrupted our sensory systems and promote overconsumption. I've looked at the literature. There isn't a study today that has actually done a head-to-head comparison of naturally flavored foods and cosmetically flavored foods and then compared relative intake of those foods. However, the lack of data doesn't stop people writing systematic reviews or opinion pieces on this topic, and there was a paper published earlier this year on added flavors as a potential contributor to body weight and obesity. And I brought this in just to use it as a highlight for what's possibly wrong with this current UPF discussion in terms of our discussion around mechanisms. Here's a paper that highlights that added flavors promote hedonic eating and override homeostatic control of food intake. This is a statement at the start of the abstract. Later in the abstract, they say, in humans, flavors are extensively tested for their toxicity, but no data exists concerning their impact on food intake and body weight. So the same abstract has contradicted itself and suggesting that both added flavors drive obesity and that there's no data to prove that. But this is the paper, a narrative opinion piece. This is the tweet. The tweet says, mechanistic studies suggest that added flavors, perhaps the best marker of UPF, are driving overeating and body weight. This is where we have the misappropriation of someone's opinion and held up as mechanistic evidence for what drives overconsumption in the UPF. We bring data to this discussion. So when I measure eating rate, we've really done hundreds of hours of work measuring eating rate and intake. And then all it takes is a tweet from someone who hasn't any data whatsoever, and this can start to become the popular narrative. So I would ask you to read this paper if you have a chance. Rick Mattis has written a very extensive paper detailing every mechanism that's currently been published and clarifying them in terms of their specificity, their clarity, and their consistency across the mechanistic links between UPF and subsequent links to energy intake and obesity. And the conclusion from this 360 reference review is no mechanistic evidence directly linking UPF intake to increased BMI, and this should not be adopted as part of the current dietary guidelines. So there now needs to be a counterpoint to some of the speculations and some of these tweets to actually put it into context. Where's the data? And we have to challenge that with better studies that ask the right questions to identify what we don't know, and to also test some of the mechanistic hypotheses that have been put forward as proof or evidence when there's no evidence to support them in relation to sensory and hedonic cues. So I posed the question, in terms of sensory properties of UPF, are they the good guys or the bad guys? In the old days when you watched a Western, it was easy to tell the good guys from the bad guys. The bad guys had a black hat, and an eye patch. The good guys had a white hat and a big smile on their face. But the food environment is much more complicated than that, as Mike has highlighted and as we heard yesterday. We don't have 7,000 foods in these databases for no reason. It's much, much more nuanced and complicated than that. We need a better understanding of how sensory and hedonic drivers influence meal size, promote pleasure, satisfaction, and promote healthy consumption. That's something that we need to have independently of processing. Meal size remains a mystery to us. I highlighted 4 things at the start that are well established. We have to understand that better in the current context as well. One solution is in terms of the hedonics of this. If it's hyperpalatable or highly rewarding, what should we do? Should we make food more expensive and less appealing? Should we just make food less tasty and make it much more expensive and tax it? These don't seem to be the good basis for public health guidance or in terms of what we should do next. And there's also a lot of argument now in the UPF and in the NOVA side saying about the precautionary principle. We don't need to know the mechanisms. We have enough data now. 1,000 papers suggest there's clear evidence to say this is bad for us. So we should start implementing policies and strategies to restrict access. I don't think we have enough evidence, and I don't think we should impose the precautionary principle in this case. I think we have to think about this much more carefully and see whether any of this is unique to the UPF as currently defined, or it's just the modern food environment, which we need to understand better in terms of how it influences the size of our meals. So I'll conclude by saying many of the proposed mechanisms have either not been formally tested or are not supported by available evidence. I think that's reasonably clear now, particularly if you read the recent review. Differences in energy density and eating rate are likely driving observed differences in ad libitum energy intake, more so than the degree of processing. And I think there's a good basis for that statement, although, again, further evidence is needed, and hopefully restructure can bring that. And our findings today show that food texture or eating rate has a stronger effect on both ad libitum energy intake and post-meal satiety than anything to do with the degree of processing observed in these trials. So the way we interact with food is going to have to be something we understand much better if we're going to try to develop strategies to restrict to limit excessive consumption of these types of meals in the future. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion later.
So we're going to move on to our next speaker. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Hall. He's the Integrative Physiology Section Chief at the National Institute for Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease at NIH. And everybody in this room knows Kevin's work already, but he's going to be covering some of the possible mechanisms linked to specific eating behaviors and weight. Dr. Hall.
Yeah, thanks. Karen basically covered it, so I don't have to say. Yeah, I'll just sit down. No, I'll give you a little bit of the history behind why we ended up doing this study, and I think it really kind of, we're in this situation where there's a lot of rhetoric on both sides of this. right? There's a lot of people claiming they understand everything about our study, why we saw what we saw, why it doesn't really represent the real things that we should be concerned about. We've seen a lot of people saying that this proves everything we need to know about ultra-processed foods driving excess energy intake. There's preciously little new data. I mean, we heard of some really nice studies that Kieran is working on. It fascinates me that there's more kind of perspective pieces, either criticizing the concept of ultra-processed foods driving many of our ills, as there are, promoting this idea. And I think that, I come from my background, my PhD is in physics, where we have a very clear distinction between theoretical physics and experimental physics. We don't have that in nutrition science, right? And these things are really important to talk to each other, right? We have to actually, yes, we can have the debates about what are theoretical models of how the system really works, and then we have to propose an experiment. Because until we actually do the experiment, it's just talk. It's just equations in physics. It's a possible explanation for how the world works. And I say that as kind of a beginning, because we all have our own biases about what theories make sense, what theories don't make sense. And if we're honest about it, we could actually design an experiment to test the way we think the world works. And I see precious little of that in this discussion. Okay, we see extremely strong opinions based on synthesizing past data, saying, oh, well, look at this. This is a big effect. This is a no effect. And I see very little kind of design of the critical experiment that's going to be needed to try to answer that question. And there is no perfect experiment. Okay, so we're always going to be able to reinterpret the results of an experiment, and that's that interplay. That's what science is about, is approaching the truth iteratively. And I say that as context because I came into this with my own biases, right? This was, nutritionism was coined by Georgi Skrinis. I don't know if I pronounced his name right. But this idea that, that we've been focusing on the wrong thing in the long history of nutrition science, on nutrients, right? And this idea that nutritionism, which is this term that Professor Skrinis coined, is basically a merging between nutrition and reductionism. And it's the reductive focus on the nutrient composition of the foods as a means of understanding their healthfulness. And there's a long and successful history of doing exactly that, right? That's kind of what nutrients are about. And so when I first kind of learned about this sort of criticism of nutrition science focusing on this reductive aspect, I was a little bit torn because the physics part of me wants to break things apart into their fundamental atomic and subatomic constituents and understand things. But at the same time, one of the things that we learned about in physics in the 1980s and the 1990s was that there are things called emergent properties that are not functions of the individual constituents of matter, but emerge as a function of their interactions. So there is the potential for emergent properties in nutrition science. So it's something to think about. We don't know everything that there is to know. There's a heck of a lot more to know. This was popularized later by Michael Pollan, who basically made the same thing. But another way, foods are essentially the sum of their nutrient parts. This is this idea. But there is this pull that then, and I don't know about the religious metaphors, Mike, but there is, a scientific notion that there are emergent properties that are not just about the nutrient parts, that there are about collections and clusters of nutrients and how they interact with the food matrix and all these other sorts of things that we don't, at least I don't understand very well. And so this kind of, the first time I started learning about this was when I first heard about this NOVA categorization system. And my visceral reaction was, this is nonsense, okay? We heard a lot about why it might be nonsense, and I read a lot of the arguments. But again, it occurred to me that a lot of the arguments against this view, and by the time I heard about this, there had already been many, many observational epidemiological studies linking ultra-processed foods to increased risk of obesity. And that's kind of my field of study. I've been focusing on, how the body responds to manipulations of carbohydrates versus fat in the diet. Done many studies related to that. And so when the people who introduced me to this NOVA system, they basically, it was at the Obesity Society meeting in Los Angeles many years ago. They said, why are you studying nutrients anymore? Why does carbs and fat? Those things aren't important. Those aren't driving obesity. Didn't we learn that from the low-fat diet years. That didn't cure obesity. You should be focusing on the extent and purpose of processing. What the hell are you talking about? Okay. And so when they explained this to me, I said, okay, well, that's interesting. Mechanistically, what do you think it is about ultra-processed foods that's driving increased risk of obesity? It's got to strike some energy imbalance. And the answer that these folks gave, and I want to be clear, it wasn't the originators of Nova. It was folks from Brazil who I think had worked with the Nova system. They said, well, these foods are high in salt, sugar, and fat, and they're low in fiber. And that's what drives people to overeat. And they're just putting Michael Moss's famous book up here because that was the idea behind this, is that there's formulations of these sort of foods that are basically supposed to make them irresistible and eat more. And I said, well, wait a second, you just named a bunch of nutrients. You can't have it both ways, right? Is it the nutrients or is it not the nutrients? And so, and again, I could have just been happy with myself. Rhetorical point. Won the argument, but I try to be a scientist, right? and the idea of science is that you can make your theoretical arguments, but you actually have to design an experiment. You actually have to do something. And it's not simply just a matter of cherry picking data from previous studies to support your viewpoint about why this is the real mechanism. You actually have to do a study. So that's what we did. We brought people into the NIH Clinical Center for 4 continuous weeks. They stayed with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a very artificial setting, right? They're in a hospital room on a metabolic ward. The only time they can leave is if they have an escort. They can go for a walk, but come back. They can't sneak off to the vending machines or something like that, which, yes, we do have at the NIH Clinical Center. In fact, right outside the door of the metabolic ward is a vending machine that I've been trying to get removed for more than a decade, but that's another story. And these folks basically come in, we tell them, this isn't a weight loss study. It's not a weight gain study. We're going to provide you a couple different diets. We're going to measure a lot of things. You can see, we're measuring using doubly labeled water. They're spending time in respiratory chambers. We're doing oral glucose tolerance tests. We're measuring their body composition. Just eat as much or as little of the foods that you want. Okay, so we've removed the convenience aspect, right? So we've moved the cost aspect. And so basically we plop down 3 meals in front of these folks and they have a box of snacks they can have anytime they want. And we want to match the diets for certain things, and we want to allow them to eat however much they want. And what they don't know is that we're measuring their leftovers, right? And we can thereby quantify exactly what they eat every day. Okay, so what did we try to match? And when I say we, I really mean the dietitians and the nutrition department staff who iterate over the meal designs over and over again and do taste tests, not quite to the same extent that Kieran's folks do with respect to independent groups rating pleasantness and measuring eating rate and all that sort of stuff. But we really try to make these menus match for many of the nutrient properties and make sure that they're as tasty as possible. The last thing we want is to admit a person and like 3 days in, they're like, oh, sorry, not interested in this. The food's terrible, right? So what did we try to match? Well, we presented them with basically many more calories than they would need on an individual basis based on their measured resting metabolic rate at screening. Okay? We tried to match for carbs and fat and sodium and fiber and sugar, because if it was just the salt, sugar, fat, and fiber, then we wanted to make sure those things were matched. We wanted to match for overall energy density of the diets, and so I'm just kind of highlighting those here. And what did the meals look like? So here's just, it's a 7-day rotating menu. Here's 3 breakfast, lunch, and dinner from one of the days on the ultra-processed diet. So matched, and 80% of the calories come from Nova Category 4 foods. Okay, but they're matched with the other diet for the presented calories, the fat, carbs, sugar, sodium, fiber, overall energy density, and actually also the glycemic load, which we calculated after someone suggested it might be a glycemic load effect of the diets, and there's no difference in glycemic load. Here's 1 day of the unprocessed meals, matched for, again, presented calories, fat, carbs, sugar, sodium, fiber, energy density, and glycemic load. So if it was the salt, the sugar, the fat, and fiber, at least my idea was we would show that there's minuscule differences in energy intake in these 20 people that don't have type 2 diabetes, but there was a wide range of BMIs. And people did as they were told, right? They ate to the same degree of hunger, fullness, satisfaction, and eating capacity. But the surprise was, I was wrong. There was an effect. And it was a pretty substantial effect that persisted throughout the 14 days on each diet, about 500 calories per day. And in fact, they gained weight on the ultra-processed diet, lost weight on the unprocessed diet, and that was reflected in changes in body fat mass as well. And by the way, we've done 4 different diets now, diet trials, and all of them have, of all of them, the only diet that has led people to gain body fat has been the ultra-processed diet. So we varied other aspects. So I don't know what that means, but it is what it is. There's a wide degree of individual variability. Okay, so what I'm plotting here on the x-axis is the difference in energy intake between the unprocessed and ultra-processed diet. And you can see that there's one guy who's up like 1,700 calories per day difference between the two diets. And not surprisingly, the difference in body weight was much, much higher for that person. But there was a very nice, linear relationship between the differences in energy intake and the differences in body weight. So, if some people have misinterpreted our data because we presented the same number of calories, that calories had nothing to do with the changes in body weight. That's not true. It was highly correlated with these. What's up with the few people who eat the same on the ultra-processed diet versus the unprocessed diet? I think that's an interesting question. Is this variability like is this an individual trait? If we repeated the study in these people, would we see this as I don't know. It might be. It might not be reproducible. It just could be what happens when you do studies in humans who behave differently in different periods. I don't think we know the answer to that question. But I think it's an interesting observation. That there may be some people who might be quite susceptible to whatever the differences were, and we'll talk a little bit about those differences in a minute, between these two diets, and other people who are completely, doesn't matter to them at all. So here's kind of the breakdown of carbs, fat, and protein. And you can see that they basically only overate carbs and fat, roughly equal proportions throughout the day. You saw this figure already. It was only the meals that they overate, not the snacks. So a lot of the talk about ultra-processed foods is about snack foods, right? The sort of junk foods and snack foods that we typically think of. But in fact, in our study, the snacks were no different in terms of calorie intake. It was really the breakfast, lunch, and dinner that were significantly different. So now we have a result. We have to explain it. And that's where the trouble begins, right? Because everyone thinks they know the answer, right? And almost immediately after this was published, people started writing to me or talking to me at conferences, and they were convinced they already knew why we observed what we observed. And what struck me was the remarkable lack of proposals for new experiments. It was just, I know how to explain your data. It's like, okay, great. The follow-up was not, you should do this next study, which I think is remarkable. I don't know if it's unique to this field or not, to just look at data and think you explain it and then just move on. That's not the way I'm used to doing science. As a physicist, we try to explain the world, yes, but then the next thing is we got to design an experiment to test it. Okay, so we shouldn't be happy with just a rhetorical explanation of things. But here's some of the things that immediately came up. Oh, well, people just like the meals more, right? It's obvious. And so, as Kieran pointed out, we used his questionnaire, and there was no significant differences in pleasantness of the meals, which I think is good news, right? It means that you could actually design foods and diets that are equally pleasant and yet have 500 calorie a day swings, right? But of course, the argument against that was, oh, well, people don't accurately report pleasantness. Well, who else am I going to ask, right? I'm going to ask the person who ate the meal whether or not they thought it was pleasant. Familiarity was not a surprise, because one of the things that we did to screen participants was just make sure that they could name or recognize at least 75% of the foods that were going to be on the menu. Because the last thing we wanted to have was some sort of neophobia effect of people like, oh, I've never seen quinoa before, I'm not going to eat that. So that wasn't a surprise that was not significantly different between the two diets. Another common theme was, you're just introducing glucose spikes, right? Ultra-processed meals, or the carbs are refined, they're absorbed much more quickly. It's going to cause a spike in your blood sugar and then a crash. We had continuous glucose monitors on these folks all the time. There's no difference in average glucose. There was no difference in the coefficient of variation of glucose. No hint of glucose differences in these folks. We heard about eating rate, right, and energy density. So the grams per minute of the ultra-processed meals were eaten more quickly, as well as the kcals per minute. And as you heard about in Kieran's talk a second ago, this is the kcals per minute. It's a product from the energy density of the foods consumed and the actual eating rate in grams. I said that we matched the meals for energy density, but of course it was quickly pointed out that you didn't, because if you take out the beverages in the ultra-processed diet, there's actually a huge difference in energy density. So the non-beverage energy density is much higher. And why do we have so many beverages? Well, we were trying to match the fiber. And so we were dissolving as much fiber as soluble fiber in the actual foods as possible, but then we were using basically 0-calorie lemonades to kind of as the vehicle for the fiber in the other case. So the question was, okay, well, you got to take out the beverages. And this is a non-beverage energy density effect. And there was some arguments back and forth about that. But interestingly, when you take out the beverages, now the eating rate of the actual ultra-processed foods was actually slower in grams per minute. Now, maybe that's not a fair comparison, right? Because it's really complicated how beverages affect eating rate, right? I mean, we know that from the Coney Island hot dog eating contest, right? I mean, the only way that they can eat hot dogs that fast is they dunk the buns in the water or whatever the beverage is. So it's maybe not a fair comparison, but again, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, oh, it's an energy density non-beverage, so we got to take that out, but then you get this effect when you take out the beverages, that people ate the foods in the ultra-processed diet more slowly. So we have to do a better job of that in the future. Okay. So what about energy density? Well, so maybe it is just an energy density effect. I'll tell you about how we're going to try to test that. But then, I was right around the time that this paper was published, Tara Fazzino at the University of Kansas came up to me and said, oh, well, have you seen our study where we're trying to kind of categorize foods not by individual nutrients or not by processing, but by pairs of nutrients that cross certain thresholds. So her idea was if we just had some objective thresholds of, fat and sugar, fat and salt, and salt and carbs crossing certain thresholds, I don't care what you call it. You can call it hyperpalatable. I don't care. It's a threshold. We can use it. You can call it a cat if you want. I don't care. But did the diets differ in these quantities? And I had a really hard time understanding that, because I told you we matched for salt and sugar and fat and carbs. So how could they be different? But she said, no, yeah, you matched that over the course of the entire day. What about what was actually on the plate of the individual meals? Did you present individual foods, more individual foods that crossed these pairs of thresholds? And sure enough, we did. So there were more of these in the ultra-processed diet, despite overall being matched for salt, sugar, fat, and carbs. We presented them with more individual foods that crossed these pairs of thresholds. In fact, the biggest difference was the salt and the fat threshold. Okay? And so one of the questions then was, could these foods be driving the effect? And is it different than energy density? Because obviously fat is a high energy dense thing. And so this gets complicated right now, because we know that the non-beverage energy density is different. We know that there's more hyperpalatable foods. I mean, we could choose to focus on these individual differences, but we decided to try to do some, again, this is just hypothesis generating, some mixed modeling, incorporating many of these things and focusing on, could we explain based on, in meal by meal basis, what were the main drivers of energy intake at a given meal across the subjects. And so I'm showing you here for the ultra-processed diet, things that were included in the model. We included energy density of the provided the non-beverage energy density of the foods, the eating rate in grams per minute, the protein content of the food, which we thought was going to be a negative contributor, given that we've heard that protein is satiating. Turned out to be actually in the opposite direction, and the percentage of calories from hyperpalatable foods on the plate. And then the interaction term between hyperpalatable foods and energy density, which was negative, meaning that when energy density of the meals was low, hyperpalatability had a greater effect. When hyperpalatability of foods were low, energy density had an even greater effect. And you can see the standardized coefficients here for this. So, energy density, all clearly statistically significant. This is just within the ultra-processed diet. These were the factors that drove meal intake. Same factors in the unprocessed diet. Okay, so these same factors, either in the ultra-processed or the unprocessed diet, drive energy intake in our study on a meal-to-meal basis. So what was mediating the effect? So we actually, this is analysis you do one at a time. So what we found was, interestingly, hyperpalatable foods mediated about 40% of the diet difference in meal intake, and so did energy density, suggesting that both of these factors might play a role. And there's, based on the within diet type, they were independent effects. So, have we explained everything? No, we haven't explained everything. We have some proposed ideas, right? This is just at the stage of hypothesis generation. I'm not going to go out and write a paper saying that we now know the effects of ultra-processed foods. This is just the first step. This is just the speculation. So what we're doing now, and we have people currently admitted at the NIH Clinical Center, over the period of COVID-19, our nutrition and nutrition staff has been working very closely with us, iterating over these diets, but we've basically designed 4 different diets. The basic, very similar to the original unprocessed and ultra-processed diet, except much less differences in beverages. So we're matching for the beverages a little bit better. But they're still going to be matched for salt, sugar, fat, fiber, carbs. We're doing a little bit better with protein matching. We've eliminated the snacks. We've taken the snacks out of the equation since they complicated several of our analyses. And there was no difference in snack intake anyway. So the original unprocessed diet had low non-beverage energy density. This one will have similar levels, and then low in hyperpalatable foods. The slightly tweaked ultra-processed diet, high in non-beverage energy density, high in hyperpalatable foods, using Tara Fazzino's definition. Third one is a reformulated ultra-processed diet. Still 80% of calories coming from NOVA Category 4 foods. High in non-beverage energy density, matched to the original tweaked ultra-processed diet, but low in hyperpalatable foods, matching the unprocessed diet. And then finally, an ultra-processed diet, still 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods, that's low in non-beverage energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods, matched to the unprocessed diet. So the study's underway. We've got about 7 people through. We need another approximately 30 people to complete this. It's a 1-month trial, 1 week on each diet, random counterbalanced order. It takes forever to do these things. Not for any good reason, just because nutrition staff can only provide meals at a certain rate, and we can only house a small number of people at a time on the metabolic ward. But we work with what we've got, and we'll get back to you in a couple of years. So, which is basically how this is going to go. But again, you actually have to do the study to figure this out. You can't just say you understand what it is and poo-poo the ideas behind either ultra-processed foods or the critiques of ultra-processed foods. And so with that, I'll end, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. That was terrific. Finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Philippa Jewell. She's a faculty fellow at the Department of Public Health Policy and Management at New York University School of Global Public Health. She'll be sharing epidemiological evidence, linking highly processed foods to health outcomes, and touching on potential mechanisms. Dr. Jewell.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to talk about potential mechanisms underlying epidemiological relationships between ultra-processed foods and cardiometabolic health. And as we know, there's a lot of speculation. We don't exactly understand the mechanism, so I'm going to give you a walkthrough of the different hypotheses and the evidence that we have. So here are my disclosures. And just to situate us, most of the epidemiological studies, pretty much all of them, have used the NOVA definition. So that is the definition that is used in this presentation. And following up on the conversation yesterday, as I said, just adding nutrients or fortifying a food does not make a food ultra-processed. So what we're talking about here are, according to NOVA, formulations of ingredients, mostly of industrial use, that have gone through multiple processes and contain different sorts of additives. All right. So as we know, there are an increasing number of observational studies linking ultra-processed foods to poor health outcomes, and in particularly to cardiometabolic health outcomes and mortality. To date, there are 9 published meta-analyses on this topic, and they have consistently found that ultra-processed foods are associated with increased risk of hypertension, metabolic syndrome, overweight, obesity, abdominal obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease incidence, and mortality, and all-cause mortality. Obviously, these are all observational studies. We only have one randomized controlled trial to this date, so we cannot establish causality. And biological mechanisms are very important to consider in order, first of all, to see if there is a potential causal link in order to test causality, and also to consider when we're thinking about a classification system, because we need to make sure that it captures relevant exposures. And from a policy perspective, biological mechanisms are also important because it will dictate the course of action. You know, can foods be reformulated to be more healthful, or are there certain processing techniques, etc., that we need to remove, or certain formulations? So there are a number of potential pathways in which ultra-processed food could increase the risk of cardiometabolic diseases and mortality. So first of all, we have the direct effects, maybe the most obvious in terms of nutrient composition, content of critical nutrients, the fact that they may displace other foods from the diets that have cardioprotective effects, such as fruits and vegetables, etc. There's also potential concern of certain additives, certain contaminants in these foods, and alterations to the food matrix, which may change the bioavailability or the bioactivity of nutrients and influence things like satiety and glycemic potential. We also have energy-mediated effects, so ways in which ultra-processed foods may lead to increased energy intakes. And you've heard all about that in the last few talks, so I will not touch on the energy-mediated effects. So starting off in terms of nutrient composition, this is a study that did a meta-analysis of 14 studies in naturally representative samples that looked at the association between ultra-processed food intake and nutritional profile and food intakes in the diet. And these studies were from 14 countries in 5 different continents, and they consistently found that diets that are high in ultra-processed foods tended to be higher in total energy intake, total fat, saturated fat, and added sugar, while being lower in fiber, protein, and multiple micronutrients. So these are all, dietary patterns that we would expect to be associated with poor cardiometabolic health. Likewise, in terms of food groups, it should be no surprise that the higher the proportion of ultra-processed foods in the diet, the lower the proportion of unprocessed foods in the diet. And in particular, ultra-processed foods tended to displace foods from categories that we generally encourage, such as beans and legumes, fruits, vegetables, and seafood. So if this is all there is, obviously we don't need to think about processing. It's all about the nutrients, it's all about the food groups, and we can just use the healthy eating index and other more traditional measures of diet quality. However, there are some evidence that ultra-processed foods may be associated with cardiometabolic health outcomes independent of diet quality and nutrient quality. As was mentioned before, multiple studies have controlled for dietary patterns, nutrient content of the diet, etc., and the associations with chronic diseases have remained. So This is a review of 37 prospective cohort studies that looked at how associations changed when diet quality or dietary patterns or nutrient composition was controlled for. And out of 66 significant associations, 64 remained after adjustment for dietary pattern or quality, and 136 out of 142 dietary adjustments did not explain the significance of the association between ultra-processed food intake and the relevant outcome. So this suggests that ultra-processed foods is associated with health outcomes, in particular cardiometabolic health outcomes, independent of diet quality. I also want to highlight another study that did an interesting job at showing this. So this is from the prospective Molisane cohort study, which is a large Italian cohort study. And what the researchers did was that they tested both individually and jointly the association between food nutritional profile measured by the Food Standards Agency Nutrient Profile System Dietary Index, which is a very long name, but it's the index that underlies the Nutri-Score, which we heard about yesterday. So based on components to encourage and components to reduce, and as well as proportion of ultra-processed foods in the diet. What they found when they analyzed these two exposures separately was that the Nutri-Score, so poorer nutritional quality, was associated with increased risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality. The same was true for high intake of ultra-processed foods, which was associated with all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality, but also with cerebrovascular mortality and mortality from other causes. They then proceeded to add both these exposures into the same model to see if that would attenuate the associations. What they found was that when the Nutri-Score was adjusted for ultra-processed food intake, both the association with all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality was significantly attenuated, meaning that this association was partly confounded by the intake of ultra-processed foods. However, the associations between ultra-processed foods and each of these outcomes were unaltered when adjusting for the nutritional profile of the diet. As a secondary aim, they also used biomarkers to assess potential biological mechanisms that would explain the excess mortality risk. In terms of the Nutri-Score, excess mortality was largely explained by glucose metabolism and total blood cholesterol, so biomarkers of these. Whereas for ultra-processed foods, the excess mortality was primarily explained by biomarkers of renal function and inflammation. So this would suggest that there are distinct and unique pathways through which ultra-processed food intake may be associated with increased mortality risk. All right, so if it's not all about the nutrient, what is it? Food additives is something that is, discussed a lot in this context. Obviously, food additives have to be evaluated through toxicological studies before they're added to foods, before they're allowed to be in the food supply, but they're generally not assessed for metabolic effects or effects on the microbiome. So I'm going to highlight a few additives that have been raised as potential additives of concern. So first of all, we have phosphate additives, which are widespread in the food supply. I pulled a few ingredient labels here from cheese, from bread, from diet soda. They all contain different phosphate additives. And the concern here is that the phosphorus in phosphate additives is highly bioavailable and may lead to excessive levels, serum levels, which may disrupt the hormonal regulation of extracellular phosphate and increase the risk or promote cardiovascular disease by promoting arterial calcification, endothelial dysfunction, and oxidative stress of endothelial cells. There's also been concern about certain types of emulsifiers. There are a lot of emulsifiers, but some of them, including carboxymethylcellulose and polysorbate 80, have been shown in animal studies to actually cause low-grade inflammation and obesity and metabolic syndrome through gut microbiota effect. So what was shown was that in mice, pretty low doses of these emulsifiers led to microbiota encroachment of the normally sterile mucus layer lining the gut, which is a marker of gut inflammation, altered species composition, and increased pro-inflammatory potential. And through fecal transplants to germ-free mice, it was shown that these alterations were actually causally linked to low-grade inflammation and obesity and metabolic syndrome. Recently, there have also been controlled feeding studies in humans that showed that carbamethylcellulose was associated with altered microbiota composition and depleted fecal metabolome in humans, and in certain subjects in a subsample also with microbiota encroachment. Furthermore, artificial sweeteners are widely used in ultra-processed foods. In a recent systematic review from the World Health Organization, it was concluded that these may be helpful to reduce body weight and reduce energy intake in the short term. So that's what evidence from randomized controlled trials suggests. Nevertheless, if we look at longer-term studies such as prospective cohort studies and case control studies, artificial sweeteners are associated with increased risk of adiposity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease and mortality. And obviously, this may be due to residual confounding or to reverse causation. Nevertheless, experimental studies show that there are, for certain artificial sweeteners, may have negative effects on glucose metabolism. So in this case, one study showed that when healthy adults consumed the sweetener sucralose in combination with a carbohydrate or sugar, but not alone, it actually impaired insulin sensitivity by decreasing the neural responses to sugar, so by a dysregulation of the glucose metabolism. And there was no effect of sucralose or carbohydrate consumption alone. This is interesting because many times when we consume an artificial sweetener, it may be in the form of a beverage together with a meal that has carbohydrates, or in a product that also has other sources of carbohydrates, even though the sugar is replaced by an artificial sweetener. Other studies have also shown that artificial sweeteners may have an effect on the microbiome in ways that induces changes to glycemic responses. There's a lot of animal research on this, but there's also a recent study in humans that showed that sucralose, aspartame, saccharin, and stevia all disrupted the microbiome balance and diversity and caused a specific microbiome alterations, which was different in different people. So some people were high responders, some people were low responders. And in case of sucralose and saccharin, it actually impaired glycemic response among the high responders. And through fecal transplants from these high responders to mice, it was able to show that these changes in the gut microbiome were causally linked to elevated glycemic responses. Right. Another potential hypothesis is that processing leads to a higher exposure to certain contaminants with known diabetic and obesogenic effects, such as acrylamide, acrolein, advanced glycation end products, etc. And that the fact that ultra-processed foods generally have a long shelf life and may be in their packaging for a long time and may be heated in the microwave in packaging may lead to increased migration of compounds of concern from the packaging, such as phthalates and bisphenol. Obviously, none of these exposures are exclusive to ultra-processed foods. These compounds are widespread in other products, non-food products in the environment, and can be formed also in your home cooking if you're toasting bread or grilling a steak. But there is epidemiologic evidence showing that higher proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet is in fact associated with higher levels of blood and urinary biomarker of several of these compounds. So this is a study using data from Haynes. They actually used a machine learning algorithm to classify processing level based on joint change in nutrients for all nutrients in the food composition. So a little different than what we've used before. But they found that level of ultra-processed foods in the diet was directly associated with markers of acrylamide, hydrocarbons, different volative compounds, phthalates, and phenols. Urinary bisphenol A. Bisphenol A. All right. Finally, processing and formulation may lead to changes in the food matrix. We've heard a lot about, how texture, for instance, and energy density could impact how much we eat of a food, but it also has potential other effects such as transit time, satiety, digestibility, bioavailability, and absorption kinetics of nutrients, and also partitioning of nutrients and energy between the host and the gut microbiome. So in terms of ultra-processed foods, they're often characterized by a highly degraded food matrix, as they may be formulated by highly purified and isolated compounds and have gone through denaturalizing treatments such as extrusion cooking or enzymatic alterations. So a concept that is gaining ground in this context is that of a cellular nutrient. So cellular nutrients are starches and proteins and sugars, etc., that are completely devoid of intact food structure. And this means that they are often completely and rapidly absorbed in the mouth, stomach, and small intestine, leaving very little nutrition for the gut microbiome. And this may have implications for the glycemic index of a food and the glycemic load of the overall diet, which is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And it's also been shown in experimental studies that an increased nutrient concentration in the small intestine may be associated with an increased pro-inflammatory potential of the microbiome. We should also acknowledge when we talk about the food matrix, we don't know everything. We know how to measure nutrients, etc., but we don't know about all of the potential synergies and antagonistic effects that exist between nutrients in an intact food matrix. So we cannot assume that an isolated nutrient will have the same effect out of the context of its original food matrix. So some studies that have showed this, for instance, are those looking at choline consumption, either in the form of eggs or in the form of choline supplements. So, for instance, eating a similar amount of choline in the form of eggs, up to 4 eggs per day, compared to a choline supplement, did not have an effect on platelet function or trimethylamine and oxide, whereas choline supplements did in fact cause a greater platelet activation and higher levels of trimethylamine and oxide, so TMAO. So therefore, there's a lot that's left to learn about this, and we cannot assume that a sum of isolated nutrients is equal to a whole food. Finally, I would like to point out that many of the factors that may be associated with ultra-processed food are potential contributor to low-grade systematic chronic inflammation, which we know is a key driver of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So as we've seen, ultra-processed foods may increase the risk for obesity by driving excessive energy intake due to their high energy density or increased energy rates. And obesity is associated with increased inflammation and also dysbiosis that may lead to inflammation. Other aspects of ultra-processed food may promote a more pro-inflammatory microbiome, again, leading to increased inflammation. Other dietary aspects associated with ultra-processed foods that are associated with inflammation are high glycemic load, high intake of salt, micronutrient deficiencies, etc., as well as increased exposure to potential contaminants that also have pro-inflammatory potential. So to conclude, there's a lot we don't know. I agree fully with Dr. Hall that we need more studies that test these hypotheses. Ultra-processed foods, as all dietary exposures, are very complex exposures, and there are many potential attributes of ultra-processed foods and many potential pathways. And this should be considered in food classification systems. I think one thing that is clear is that it's not just about the nutrients. There are other pathways. Thank you so much.
So welcome back. This is the final segment of what I would say was a very productive morning. And the aim here is really to leave this last 30 minutes or so as an opportunity to kind of leverage what we've learned yesterday and what we've learned today. Hey, I'm going to ask those of you in the back of the room to kind of get back to your seats because we only have 30 minutes and we got a lot to cover. That includes you, my friends in the back, Reagan. Okay, so again, what we're going to try to do here is open it up for questions, continue the dialogue that we had so brilliantly in the last segment, and it is going to be pretty open-ended. I do have some points that I think we've been capturing over the last 2 days, which I think are going to be useful, but really we want to think about and going back to the objectives of the meeting overall. We wanted to use it this time to drive towards the concept of what considerations for food classification systems really can be applied in research and that support sound public health policy. So it's really about linking these considerations we're making, the discussions over yesterday and today, to how we can drive it forward for research, and then how that, in fact, can be used to support public health policy. And so 2 steps. I just want a couple of points that I think we have put up on the first slide here are going to really be, I would say, are there points of general agreement? Well, let me start with this first. I should say, here are my disclosures. So funding from USDA, from NIH, and from PepsiCo and Cargill, as well as scientific advisory boards and stocks and everything else, and my employer at University of Arkansas for medical sciences. Okay, so when we get into this aspect of maybe start out with, are there points of general agreement? And this isn't really to create a lot of debate, but I just want to bring them up to see if this is in fact consistent with what we are hearing. So I think what I did hear from all sides over the last 2 days is that any food classification system, maybe with the exception of Mike, who thinks the current one is fine, and maybe the current one covers this, but any food classification system should align with healthy, affordable, accessible food supply and with dietary guidance, right, as it emerges, as it grows. So it should be used in that context. So we feeling that that's still consistent. Okay. So we do agree on a lot. And I think that gets to the crux of why we're here, right? We do want to get to the point that we want to improve the situation where it needs to be. Food processing and food formulation. We've heard the term ultra processing, highly processed, et cetera. And I think generally we have come to an understanding collectively that these are 2 distinct pieces, although it's part of one unifying approach, but they may have different roles and potential health implications or implications overall. So by that I mean the formulation versus the physical processing, and then I can even go further and say processing in the home versus industrial scale of processing. So those are just 2 of the general, I would say, tenets. And of course, the one on top there is probably the most important, that we want these to be science-based and support meaningful research. So just to start that as a starting point. From that, I'm just going to start inviting questions, discussion, I think continuing from what we were at in the last one. And there's a couple of points perhaps to stimulate some of that talk. So where are some of the evidence gaps that have been discussed today? So first, no one system is capturing the diversity of products in the consumer space or aligning with outcomes right now. No one system is in fact doing that. I think we saw some good evidence from Mike. We saw a lot of discussion in this space. This is a gap. What are the needs for mechanistic exploration? And I'm just going to throw out a couple of points. Are there plausible mechanisms by which processing and or formulation impact metabolic processes? And how do we separate ingredient formulation effects from physical processing and sensory and eating behavior? How do we tweeze those individual things out? So open it up for discussion. And perhaps, Johanna, I'm going to let you start with some questions because I know you had one for the last session.
Yeah, what I was going to say was, thank you for a wonderful morning. It was just terrific. And I guess what bothers me enormously is why there haven't been more experiments. I think Dr. Hall pointed that out. This wasn't always the case. If you think about, some of you probably remember the Feingold diet years and years ago. where there were some very good studies, blinded studies, experimental studies to take a look at that hypothesis, which didn't turn out to be very robust. It had to do with food additives too. My second issue, so I think that we all agree that we need more experimental studies. And the second thing I wanted to say was whether there is some way of developing designs for experiments that incorporate this adversarial issue of getting people together who really disagree violently and having them criticize each other's experiments and then building better experiments going forward. And again, I think it's unfortunate that most of much of the very good work right now is being done in Europe, and I don't see as much being done here in the United States. And the third thing is the whole issue of policy and food classification, especially when it comes to international bodies or government money that goes into classification systems. And I come here at the issues from some of the problems I've personally had in trying to work to develop dietary supplement databases. The problem here is that what people really want, or at least your mother or grandmother really wants, is a database where she can look up all of the supplements that will keep her from getting memory loss or keep her from losing physical performance. And there are marketing claims for these products that say they're going to do this. The question is, what is the evidence that they really do that? And when you go and look, there are a couple of things probably that work. Caffeine works in some cases for waking people up. But besides that, is there any data that supports making a classification scheme that does that? And the answer is there isn't. And so I come back to that with the question of a food classification system that we're talking about today. And how does one get objective measures that show that these are really something that should go into the database? But I've really enjoyed this conference, and thank you.
Thoughts? Eric, I see you up.
So this is probably the 20th of these events that I've been to. And we're kind of going in circles, right? And I think we do need more research, right? But the problem is who's going to fund that research? You know, Karen can do it because the sensory stuff has multiple interests to multiple factors. But on truly the clinical trials, I'm guessing there's been many proposals that have gone out there. They're just not getting funded. So how do we get a consortium, or how do we get some group of people to come together to start to fund this kind of research so we can really move it forward? And until that happens, or until NIH or somebody steps in, we're just going to keep going in circles.
Yeah, those are good points. And I think the funding of this is one key thing, and then the motivation of folks that would fund this is the other piece to consider. John?
Yeah, John Erdman, University of Illinois. I think food matrix is so important. And I was going to make the same point that was just made. How do we get, the food scientists, the physicists, the sensory people, everybody together and work on the food matrix issue? And this is multiple studies. So if, I'm sure Kevin Hall has thought this through in his group when they're making their products. So you tweak one little thing, it changes everything else. You ferment the food, you extrude it. There's many different ways of extruding. We're talking about multiple trials that are needed to kind of sort out the matrix issue. So it's going to require funding, centers, and multiple investigators.
Good point. Any thoughts? Karen, you might be good in this space because I know we've talked about it, but in that regard, when we think about structure in the matrix, or should we think about function in the matrix? And that if you think about it that way, maybe there are fewer variables to tweak if we think about identifying the actual function, whether that's digestibility, whether it's nutrient release or otherwise.
Yeah, I think the matrix is rapidly becoming the new microbiome. We do have to be a little bit careful there that we don't start to sort of say, no, we don't know, it's the matrix. And that's certainly the case in Europe. There's been some discussions in Nutrition Society winter meeting, ultra-processed foods, it's the matrix. And, discussions around fermentable carbohydrates are not getting to the gut and the impact it has. It's all fine in a model. But in reality, of course, matrix effects are well understood in some areas, and Connie's done all the work in dairy. They're less well understood in other areas, and there's a distinction to be made between refining an ingredient and processing an ingredient in terms of its composition and its structure. With restructure, we're looking at the macro structure of diets. The main thing is about how we interact with the physical properties of food, not food form, but the texture properties within solid foods. We have a new project now that's just getting underway, MetaPro, the metabolic response to processed foods, and there we're looking at degrees of processing, matrix integrity, and in vitro and in vivo responses. And the goal is to bring some new data to qualify some of the statements that have been made in the past about how matrix is driving all of this because of something magic that happens in your microbiome. And it's important to debunk some of these myths because it's very casual the way people can start talking about specific ingredients and membrane permeability in the matrix. I think, we heard earlier about some examples of carbohydrates. I was talking to Eric yesterday about this. Inulin, the resistant starch, it's a prebiotic, and it's noted for its health benefits. It's been added to every other major food product for many years to promote health and then promote microbiome. It's also an additive, it's a gelling agent, it's a stabilizer. From a food science point of view, we think of it completely differently. Yeah. And so that kind of dichotomy, if you have an agenda and you want to prove a point that additives are bad, it's very easy to make that kind of a statement. But as a food scientist, we know we add inulin for a wide range of reasons with noted health benefits. So in that sense, I think we need to objectify this discussion a little bit and leave the emotion at the front door and start to bring data to those comparisons in a meaningful way without any kind of bias.
Yeah, that really builds sort of, John, what you were saying, this interdisciplinary approach that we all talk about often is probably in practice not something that's being implemented uniformly, of course. Is very difficult to do that. But at the same time, I think of proteins and the functionality in a food. I think of lipids and their functionality in the food and in the structure of the food, why we want solid fat in certain products for structure. And what happens when you take that out, why you can't have certain types of food, regardless if they're categorized as ultra-processed or not. So the lexicon is a challenge. The awareness of the fact that a lot of the foods we're talking about are highly processed but are categorized as unprocessed because they're highly refined and recombined. And I think there's the dichotomy of that is we think about it so much as a food scientist from the structure perspective that we don't necessarily always think of the function. And that is a conversation, as you said, the matrix is becoming the next microbiome, which means we'll probably put the tag omics at the end of it and call matrix omics, and then we'll all be good.
Yeah, so I'm tagging in here because I think that there's a long string of the previous questioners highlighting the importance of new studies. Of course, that's only true if we get away from this dichotomy of the folks who say that we don't need new studies because ultra-processed foods are definitively linked with health outcomes and we need to act, versus the other side, which is ultra-processed foods are a hopelessly flawed way to look at things, and there's no signal in these observation epidemiology cohorts that we can't explain using other things, so we don't need to study it. I think if we can come together with a little bit of humility and say, we don't understand everything. Yes, there might be problems with the epidemiological literature, which require some other ways of analyzing the data that currently exist to maybe subcategorize things or use some causal inference methods applied to those kinds of data, while at the same time saying we can't completely ignore it either and try to target based on hypothetical mechanisms, which we think are probably the most important drivers, and try to explain away the effect. And you have to do that with not just rhetoric, but new data. And I think that's, if we could come together with that, as opposed to having these two polarized arguments, it's either nothing to see here, it's hopelessly flawed, or we know everything that we need to know to act. I don't think either of those are correct. I think we need to just kind of honestly say, there's a lot that we don't know, and we need to design studies and work together with food scientists, nutrition scientists, physicists, to try to actually figure this out. So anyway, I hope we can all agree on that.
I think that's a great point, that it is a continuum. It shouldn't be 2 points out there. And I mean, I'd like to hear what others think about this, but if we go into that space and you say, look, is there a willingness to improve the food supply for constant improvement as we think about it? I think you would hear that both sides would agree with that. That's what I said in the first statement. I think we can all agree on the fact that we want a safe, affordable, accessible, nutritious, and quality food supply. But what we don't know is what we don't know, and I think we're seeing that in lots of spaces, including what you hear now is being termed as the dark matter of food. Like we focus so much on composition, on the things we know, but there's a whole lot about food that we don't know that we need to explore, and that's maybe the fertile territory to explore that. But Dave.
So one of the issues, that Reagan emphasized yesterday was the switch from dietary guidance on isolated nutrients to dietary patterns. And I don't see this system being useful in analyzing a dietary pattern. You're going to say it's okay to have 25% UPF in a healthy diet. We saw yesterday you can have 80 or 90% UPF in a healthy diet. So the key is, what are you going to recommend for a healthy diet? Is it worth reproducing the errors we made 45 years ago with saying fat and cholesterol are the only thing you need to be concerned about? That didn't go so well.
Good point. Reagan, thoughts? Very agreeable. Johanna?
Since we have some Europeans here, sort of. I wonder if you might be able to speak to the European Union's platforms. Are we using the right funding mechanisms for developing these large scale studies? It seems to me the Europeans are ahead of us in this area. Maybe I'm wrong, but I wondered if you had any comments on that mechanism that you use in Europe.
Yeah, we do it differently. It's partly, you have to remember the politics of the European Union. It was a union set up to establish peace in Europe, and it's done that pretty well. And one way of ensuring that continues is for people to get to know one another. So in every aspect of life in Europe, we're encouraged to work. In the research area, you cannot submit a grant on your own. It has to be done across countries. And also, you can't submit a grant until you have met the industrial input requirement. So they do not give out money to academics without industry involvement. They'll specify exactly how much they want you to get, how many SMEs you want involved, and so forth. And these large collaborative studies can do things that individual researchers can't do. And I know that Kevin has once proposed the establishment of big bases for the development of clinical trials, and those sorts of things are needed. I really like Hannah Danilo in Munich, who said that one day somebody thought of CERN. Now, they must have said at the dinner table, "You're nuts." Unless somebody thinks about these things, they'll never happen. So I do think we need structures for making very complicated studies, because that's what these studies are. They're very, very complicated, making them possible through collaboration. And we do it better in Europe than you do here, I think. But we're still a long way off. I don't see loads of money being poured into this particular area at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting, the standpoint of the guiding principles that we kind of follow with public-private partnerships in the U.S. seem to be great on paper, but in practice, they open up the door for so much criticism that it gets difficult to address tough challenges like this. So that's an excellent point, that we maybe look at different models.
So Christy Reimers with ConAgra, and I'm, of course, thinking about the consumer and how this all applies and bringing it back to the pragmatic level. It occurs to me that one of the things we can't lose sight of is the nomenclature, and we're talking about this a lot. Is it really processing? Is it formulation? Is it something else? And it feels like that moving away from that ultra-processed nomenclature and talking more specifically about what we're really focused on, what we're studying specifically, would be helpful. And I say that because I always think of innovation. How do we innovate so that we actually do get healthier foods? And of course, with the NOVA UPF system, there's no way to innovate yourself out of being UPF. And so I think it's very important to also keep in mind, as the research is happening, how it can be applied to innovation for healthier foods.
That's a great point. And, I kind of maybe part of the last point, which is how do you leverage anything to improve the quality and innovate? But the ability to innovate, we heard the whole grain examples as being one area. That's because the industry had the opportunity to innovate from genetics all the way through processing. But we don't see that level of freedom in other food categories. So that's a really good point, is it probably has to be a combination of just of any classification. But then what is going to be your freedom to innovate? Excellent point.
Barbara Rolls, Penn State. So the first things I would say to my students when they're designing a study is, what's your question and what are the definitions of what you're looking at? And we're calling for research that's going to be very, very challenging, expensive, long-term, and we haven't really clarified what we're talking about. We haven't agreed on a definition of whether it's a NOVA category or something else, whether it's formulation, is it refining, is it matrix, all these different things. So I think before we can justify getting all of the money that it's going to take to look at these issues, we need to make some upfront decisions. The session I was chairing yesterday, we had a whole bunch of questions that, because the audience was so active, we didn't get to some of the ones that the program people put together. So one of them was, are there recommendations on how intake of ultra-processed foods should be expressed in research? Frequency versus proportion of energy, and then since virtually all diets have some ultra-processed foods, is there a threshold? So does anybody want to comment on that? That was something that we had hoped to discuss and didn't get to.
The mic is very far away. Sorry about that.
Sorry, Anna Rosales with IFT. Just a consideration as I'm sitting back there thinking about what would make meaningful public health policy. I feel like we are talking about the need for interdisciplinary research, but we aren't necessarily talking about the need for more social scientists and public health scientists. Because we can innovate a system that's brilliant and scientifically sound for us, but if it falls flat and doesn't meet a consumer where they're at, if it takes more time and more money than what they can afford or what they have available, it's kind of useless. And I think we must include the consumer in these conversations and who we're intending to help benefit from all of this.
Very good point. Is it actionable? Is it implementable?
Is it acceptable?
Yeah. Is it affordable? As Adam, you have said repeatedly, that'll be the primary driver. I had these other points, which actually we're touching on. Wendell, I see you standing up, but what are objective metrics for food characteristics that relate to healthy diets? I think this is getting a little bit, Barbara, to yours. How do we separate research needs from consumer-facing classifications? Maybe that's actually something we just touched on. You may not need to separate, you need to align them. And you can see here how classifications can be used in the context of existing messages about healthy food choices. Are we just creating confusion when we already have, Dave, you said, a system that seems to be working and we don't want to disrupt again? So thoughts? And everybody's getting tired.
I can provide this online comment, which was along the lines of, should this classification system include other metrics like cost, like environment, to Dr. Gibney's point about a metric for the food system instead of just focusing on health?
So broadening it out, which is more integrated with aspects of where our food comes from. Yep. Very good point. Cindy.
So Naomi Fukugawa, Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center for the USDA. but I am not speaking on behalf of the federal government, but I'm wearing my clinical hat. And I do think that a lot of our emphasis on reductionist science and classification systems and everything is really very good for job security. But we're at the point now in the world where we have billions of people to feed, have them access to affordable food that's safe. And so therefore, I think we probably should put our collective knowledge together to now work collectively and collaboratively to try to answer these gaps that have been raised, rather than continuing to polarize decisions and things. So I agree with Mike that there are a few things that we've actually done, and that if we continue to sort of, spend a lot of this interesting discussion, we might lose the battle in the long run.
Yeah, and
so
those are excellent points, Naomi. I think part of it is, Mike, go ahead.
I just want to make the point that the big problem we're facing, obesity and some of its related comorbidities, the spend on the prevention of that is minimal and non-existent. I mean, in the United Kingdom, where I got this data, the budget on research for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds is greater than the entire expenditure by the health service in the UK on preventing obesity. So you have to spend the cost of a few submarines in every state to help people tackle the issue of obesity, because we know enough to help them get half of the way. It happens in hospitals when people are overweight, they're treated and they can lose their weight. But I just think that as scientists, we have to also say society has to put its money where its mouth is, because otherwise it's not going to happen. Put your money in.
Again, excellent points. I mean, we're talking more, kind of dovetails, Naomi, with what you were saying, and also with Anna, in terms of the social aspect of this. Research has to also, what I'm hearing is, include implementation science. And then it has to actually go further than that and actually talk about programmatic effect that is impactful, like you said, but that takes real money, and it's often not part of it. I mean, is there a part of this that says because there's a problem we can get research funding, we'll continue to have this problem? But from what I'm hearing, we don't have a whole lot of RFAs out there that are allowing us to study this in the way we want. So it's an interesting dynamic at the moment. Other thoughts? We have a few minutes left. Yep. Adam, Kelly.
I totally enjoyed the talks, and I think that there are a number of deeply held beliefs and attitudes about ultra-processed foods or foods falling into the ultra-processed category, for or against. But let me offer one observation. The overwhelming tide of ultra-processed foods will break on the rock of plant-based proteins, because you cannot promote plant-based diets and demonize ultra-processed foods at the same time. So as a result, sooner or later we'll be hearing from authorities here in Europe or in Brazil that perhaps plant-based proteins aren't really ultra-processed at all. Perhaps they are really minimally processed, and perhaps the entire system will need to change. So before you get too engaged into defining ultra-processed foods, bear in mind that the directives coming from wherever may change. And I think that plant-based proteins are going to be the rock on which the entire thing breaks. Because I'm thinking, going back to Carlos's papers from 10 years ago, he was hoping to catch Pepsi and Coke and so on in the web of ultra-processed foods, the chips, the Oreo cookies, and so on. What he caught instead was soy. And the soy people are not happy, and the plant-based people are not happy, and the whole thing will break on that. So just mark my words. I can come back later on, and you'll see that I was right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation, and it is the one category that is very transparent about what they're doing from the ingredient side, for sure, because they have to. They have to functionalize that protein for the products they need. You just can't do it otherwise. So it's a really good point. Yeah.
Kelly Higgins, USDA's Agricultural Research Service. So let's say we get our act together, we fund the research, and we solve this problem, and say we have a recommendation that comes out of it. Do we actually think the general public is going to follow it? If we tell them, stop eating these foods that are really easy to prepare for our families, they're not following the recommendations we already have that are based on sound science. So I think something that's missing here is we need to focus on behavior change and how to actually get people to consume a diet that is healthier for them based on the science we know now, let alone what comes in the future from this work.
Good point. Let me ask a follow-up question, though. If the outcomes point to actionable change in the food system, is that the alternative where you can keep people where they are, but actually improve the quality of what you're providing them? Say you find something.
Yeah, I mean,
that's the ultimate goal.
I mean, as far as sodium reduction goes, we've proven it's very difficult to get people to stop consuming sodium. So the solution is changes to the food supply.
Right.
Do reductions there. So it's a two-sided approach, and I think you need both. But actually focusing on behavior change is something that's really important.
I agree. I'm wondering if we're going to get to the big discovery of the things we already know. So we already know saturated fat, we know sodium, we know added sugar, and are we still going to get there after funding a lot of studies? It'll be interesting to know. We may not. And maybe the matrix.
The point that I was going to say, is this just a distraction? It was one of the thoughts I'm having in the back of the room as we're thinking about how much money, funding, research, collaboration, all of which I am like 200% always advocating for more research dollars. We need more. But it makes me wonder, is this just distracting us from something that we already know and taking kind of the focus away, calling it something else, and further confusing consumers?
Agreed. And to build on that, are we also further confusing the food and ag sector who are already making strides in reducing what we know are problems and changing formulations? I just had a thought there. Is it distracting? Is it a focus? This is part of the conversation.
Julie Hess, USDA. This is a bit of a counterpoint and an add, and I can't take credit for this comment because this is kind of an amalgamation of the conversations I've had over the past day. But I think one of the benefits to the conversation about ultra-processed foods is that it's showcasing just how interdisciplinary nutrition research has to be in order to work. So Adam, you brought up several times the issue of food cost. That's something that's not currently really included in dietary guidelines. And I think that's something that belongs as a consideration. If we want people to actually eat healthier diets across the U.S., we have to think about where they are and meeting them where they are. Every single person in this room and every single person listening in on the call and probably every single person doesn't think that food is just sustenance. It's more than that. And so I think we have to look broader than that. And it's not just interdisciplinary in terms of food science and nutrition science working together. There's also dancing around the edges of this ultra-processed foods idea. There's a gender equity issue. There's, as we discussed yesterday, there's home economics considerations that kind of came up in our panel and we talked about a little bit, but we need to bring these things to the forefront. There's an opportunity for a lot of people to be part of this discussion. There's an opportunity for education scholars, for communications folks. There's a lot that we can do with this if we take the opportunity as a nutrition science and food science community to really do the work that needs to be done. And it's beyond what we can do on our own.
Those are excellent points. And I think the gender equity thing is interesting. Processing is, if you go to the developing world, is viewed as a great equalizer because of the way it can speed up meal preparation, give time back, and it's something that we may be forgetting in many ways here, that it's part of the solution in some places, not a problem. But we got two more, and I know we're at time, but go ahead, Lauren.
Lauren O'Connor, ARS. I don't really know how to say this, but there's all this conversation about bringing people together and interdisciplinary teams, and we were successful in that at our workshop in Hot Springs. We had an amazing group of people who were having collegial conversations about this topic. And I was very excited as an early career scientist. I was like, this is awesome. Everyone's together. Since then, everyone has just gone back to their silos. So I don't know how to continue that momentum that we had, because it's a similar concept to what everyone's saying, is getting people together. And Sylvia Rose said something at Hot Springs that just stuck with me so much, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We don't agree. Scientists never agree on anything. We debate the stupidest little things all the time. That's our personality. That's why we're here. That's why we're all in this room. But we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And you might not agree with how someone is doing something, but if you don't engage with them, their research approach is not going to change. We're not going to be able to meet in the middle unless we stop trying to make the perfect study or the perfect approach. So it's more just me
So what
complaining.
I'm hearing is we need to have a mechanism by which these conversations continue, and we encourage that path to be continued.
Yes, the
we have to
conversation.
come up with a framework to let that continue.
Yes, the conversations need to continue. There needs to be senior investigators supporting early career scientists who have the time and the momentum to lead these large projects forward. And we also have to be really careful in how we're talking to each other. Kelly and I had whistles in Hot Springs, and anytime anyone said garbage or trash, we literally blew a whistle. And we only had to do it twice, and I had to blow it on Kelly one time. But I mean, we have to act like we respect each other, and otherwise it's just going to keep polarizing. So just my comments and complaints from my perspective.
All right, one last. I'm going to get the hook here soon.
So I have an incredibly in the weeds comment or question that I think might have broader implications. Kevin, I'm wondering why there's not a moderately processed arm to the studies. It's always the binaries that we're comparing, unprocessed to highly processed. And maybe it's the problem with the classification systems. There's just not enough foods that fall into that middle ground. But it seems like that could be kind of an easy way to just encourage less processed. You don't need to eat whole raw food all the time. You could have a more moderately processed diet. And it seems like moderately processed foods just get completely lost in the conversation, but they can be very convenient, easy to choose options, particularly for lower income families that I think we all want to encourage healthier eating for them. So my peanut gallery comment for your
just answer it in front of the mic so people can hear. Cost? You can only do so many, and I want to finish this decade, right? I mean, I have a limited throughput in our studies, right? So, but one of the things that was interesting was we did another ad libitum feeding study looking at low carb versus low fat diets. So were there moderate, like huge differences? Again, that's my nature, is to generate huge differences and see if I can see an effect. That's usually a good first step to find something. In that case, we didn't even consider ultra processed foods. We were trying to generate them from minimally processed diets. And so afterwards, we went back and said, are these actually, how ultra processed are they using Nova for? And it turned out they were roughly 30 to 40% ultra processed, even though we were trying to make them from relatively whole foods ingredients. It's because, like we talked about earlier, when you actually want to save time, you don't make your own mayonnaise, right? You buy mayonnaise, and most of the mayonnaise is ultra processed. But yeah, to do these kinds of dose response studies in a controlled feeding study, yeah, sure, build me the big facility like the big particle accelerator at CERN for doing these kinds of studies where we can house 100 people at a time and we can do dose response, and I can finish the study that now takes me 2 years and a month, literally. Let's do it.
Just builds on what we were just discussing and not let perfection be the enemy of good. So with that, I will stop. Thank you for all the comments, and I will hand it over to John to wrap up.
So Mario, thank you very much for leading this discussion, and I want to thank, nice music. So I want to thank all speakers. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the staff and IFNs for running this, particularly Marie. I think it's been a very timely 2 days. We haven't had any whistles, and we hadn't had to pull anybody off the stage or from the microphone. So I want to hear a round of applause for all of the speakers. So as we mentioned on the outset, the planning committee and speakers, we're going to be putting a perspectives paper together that kind of summarizes this last session, and that is, where are we in alignment at this point, and where is there a need for further investigation, where are the gaps, and we'll be putting that together as a publication. I think that all of us have come away with a better perspective, I think, and better appreciation for both sides of, or several sides of the equation. And I know that I've come away with a knowledge of far more gaps than I was aware of before. So this is going to wrap up the session. I thank the people who have been online. Thank you all for attending, and travel safely home.